All right. On behalf of Bryant's Alumni Association, welcome to our final webinar of the fall, designed to share professional expertise with members of the Bryant community. My name is Sade Hunt Shante, class of 2017, and I work in the Office of Alumni and Parent Engagement. Today you will hear from Beth Carter, a well-known presenter, Bryant alumna, professor, certified executive, business and career coach, and also member of the National Alumni Council. Our webinar will be moderated by Shanel Anthony, outstanding facilitator, Bryant alumnus, and key member of the National Alumni Council. Before we start, let's establish the structure of today's webinar, which will last for 1 hour. All participants are in a listen-only mode. However, we encourage you to comment, respond to polls, and ask questions using the question and answer feature located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. We'll answer all questions at the end of the webinar. After today's presentation, you will receive a survey. Please take a moment to provide feedback. Your comments are valuable as we expand our professional development programs. Now, I'll turn the program over to Shanel Anthony, class of 2002 and 2003 MBA. He is the regional manager at Medtronic, where he exceeds sales goals and sits on various committees, often leading initiatives. He has helped strengthen Bryant's relationship with both athletic and multicultural alumni and has helped plan campus panels and regional events. All right, Shanel, take it away.
Thank you, Sade, and welcome everyone. I'm really proud. Well, first off, I'm proud to be on this call. I'm happy to be on this call because, as Sade mentioned, I'm a regional manager at Medtronic, managing a team of 10 people, and professionally, negotiations is very important. But more importantly, I'm newlywed. So if you want to stay married, I think negotiations is even more important in that context. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our speaker about some really good pearls on how this can help me personally and professionally. I'm proud to introduce today's presenter, Beth Carter. Beth is a class of 1985 and a proud parent of one Bryant alumnus and one current student. Beth is the owner of Carter Consultants Ltd, which is a global executive search firm. Beth Carter Enterprises, a professional coaching, business, training, and speaking organization. So Beth also has presented and serves on the Bryant University Women's Summit Committee. This is her 4th career webinar that she has presented on. I'm really excited. So let's start with today's presentation on the art and science of negotiations.
Thanks, Sade and Shanel. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to be doing this today. I have done one other of the 4 webinars for Bryant on negotiations, but we're going to go a little more in depth today. Although I will answer questions at the end, if you do have questions during the presentation, let's answer them as we get to them. So today we're going to cover, hold on. Today our objectives are, how do you prepare for the negotiation? This is critical before you even think to start negotiating. What type of negotiator are you? How do you respond to the offer? And what mistakes should you not make? Because if you know what kind of mistakes are out there, hopefully you'll avoid them. So before we get started, I just kind of want to know a little bit more about the audience. Are you on this call because you're interested in salary negotiations? And that's not necessarily just base and bonus. Or are you working for a corporation or even as a business owner like myself, and you're doing more contract negotiations? Or maybe there's other types of negotiations that you're interested in. So, Shanel, we're going to launch the poll right now, and we'd be very interested to hear what our audience is most focused on today's call. So I see we have some people already responding to the poll. Oh, there's the polls open now, so please let us know. Salary negotiations, as I said before, is really focused, not anymore on just base and bonus. When I graduated from Bryant, that was really the heavy focus. Now there's a lot of other components to your negotiations. Of course, contract negotiations can be, a small contract. It could be, a significant project. It could be some other types of things. We're not going to get into personal negotiations necessarily, but if you become a better negotiator in one aspect of your life, hopefully it will affect others. So how's the poll going, Shanel?
So So 91% of people have voted, and I think that's it. So we'll close this poll for now.
Okay, and what are they most focused on today?
So it looks like 44% are interested in other types of negotiations, 36% are interested in contract negotiations, and 21% are interested in salary negotiations.
Okay, great. So the people that, the 46% that said about other types of negotiations, you can use your chat box to tell us what types of negotiations you're interested in, and maybe we can address some of those. So let's get started here. So how to prepare. So considering the salary one was actually the lowest, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but I do want to mention a few different things, especially if we have younger alumni on the site. The reason why I say that is I also teach team building and conflict resolution at Bryant. It's a 400 level course. And we have been talking about negotiations in my class. The thing with salary negotiations that people don't realize is that a lot of people don't have a personal budget. So you don't even know how much money to make to cover all your expenses. So it's not just your monthly expenses like mortgage, maybe a car payment, a student loan, things along those lines. But you also do have to think about the seasonal expenses, like maybe snow removal or air conditioning costs or heating bills. And then the ones that crop up periodically, meaning if you have to dress and wear a suit every day, then you might have things like dry cleaning bills. The other thing to keep in mind is with salary negotiations is what are the responsibilities? As a recruiter for over 30 years, I can tell you that a lot of times, we think that the candidate is going to fit the job spec, 100%, but all of a sudden they may have an MBA, they may speak a foreign language, they may have lived overseas, they may have taken on a type of responsibility that wasn't in the initial job description. So that's a bargaining tool for the candidate. The other thing is what's the future potential? Where is this job going to lead down the road? And then there's other factors to consider too. A lot of people go into negotiations, regardless if it's salary or other, that they have to understand there's a real value. I mean, why you're talking to this person, about anything, why is it a real value to you and to the organization? So obviously in a salary negotiation, the reason why they're hiring you is they have a gap and they need you. So you have to understand that, but there also might be a perceived value. And considering we've all been negotiating since we were able to talk, a lot of times we forget that we really do bring value to the table. The thing is that, you have to keep in mind also other things like cost of living differential if you're moving from one part of the country to the other. If you're going to be traveling, maybe you need daycare or night care for your children, or the dog sitter. I just recently got a dog, so now that's been another added expense when I travel. So these are all the things that you really need to keep in mind. So let's look at it more from a business perspective. What is one of the business negotiations? Again, you need to have a budget. If you are going after a big contract and you're bringing in outside vendors, how much are they going to cost? What are the ramifications if they back out? Do you have a plan B in terms of other types of vendors you can use? What is the, how often do they want to be paid, or how often do you plan on paying them? I have some clients that pay me in 2 weeks, some clients pay in a month, and some clients pay in 60 days. I don't take anything beyond that. So again, this is something you need to think about and work through your budget. Also, travel expenses, hotel, who's paying for those? Is the client paying for them, or are you paying for them? And even things like preparation of reports, taxes, people tend to forget that piece of it too. So just keep that all in mind. The other piece is future potential work. So if someone is willing to give you a retainer for X amount of time, let's say it's a 6-month retainer, you might reduce your fee a little bit because it's consistent work than you having to go out and get 6 clients, 1 a month. It also may be that they'll boost or enhance your reputation. Maybe they're willing to, mention it could even be in employee communications, it could be through other means about the work you're doing. Also, maybe it's a co-marketing operation in the sense that you're going to do the work with them, but they're going to co-market it out into the marketplace, and so you're getting kind of free advertising.
Hello, everyone. I think we lost Beth's audio. Give us a brief moment. Beth, are you able to just repeat what you said from that slide? A bunch of us lost your audio.
Okay, right from the beginning of this slide, Sade?
Yes, please.
Okay, so in terms of a business negotiation, you also have to have a budget. So you need to take into consideration things like if you're using outside vendors, how much are they going to cost? Have you looked at different vendors? Because what happens if for some reason an emergency happens or that vendor cannot be all of a sudden at the last minute not available? So how much is the second vendor if you go that route? Also take into consideration things like taxes. People forget about that. Printing costs. There's other pieces too that you might want to consider as you're developing this budget, but make sure it's very, very comprehensive. You definitely want to be on the side of conservative in terms of your numbers so that when you take into consideration even things that may never even crop up, but you want to take that all into consideration so that when you bid on something or you're negotiating, you know what your absolute max expenses you'll be on that. The next piece is future potential work. So if a client is willing to do 6 months retainer, pay you once a month for 6 months, that means, especially for a small business owner like myself, I'm not having to go out and get 6 clients, one a month. It's nice to have one client on a retainer. So maybe I might reduce my fee a little bit, or I might work out some other kind of arrangement with them. So you have to think about that as well. Other factors to consider is your reputation. If once this project's done or as the project's going along, they may turn around and, give you some good PR. You might be part of an advertising campaign that they're doing, especially if, let's say, if they're promoting a product or service, they might say that they're engaged with you. That's, free advertising that has a factor in it. And that goes along with co-marketing too. There's been times where we've seen companies partner and they co-market. So when you're negotiating, that might be another factor. Another piece, which is of course my favorite, is that they refer you to other people. I recently met with a client. She's an executive search client of mine, but I mentioned that I wanted to get more into speaking and training. And so she said, oh, I'm more than happy to introduce you to some of my clients for that piece of work. So any client that's willing to refer you or write a great recommendation that you can put on your LinkedIn or put on your website or whatever is always a plus. And then again, you also want to worry about, or consider, I should say, how fast they're going to pay you. I mean, I have some clients that pay me in 2 weeks, some clients pay me in a month, other clients pay 60 days. I don't take any clients that pay me beyond 60 days. But that's something that you have to work out, and you have to look at your own expenses. If you're paying a vendor, let's say every 2 weeks, but you're not getting paid until every month, you need to figure that out. So these are all parts of the negotiation. I don't see in the chat box so far the people that were interested in other types of negotiations mentioning what types of negotiations they're interested in. So if you are interested in something specific, please type it in the chat box. Okay, so we've talked about the science part, which is really the nuts and bolts of negotiations, figuring out your numbers, mapping out a plan, but you really need to figure out, more importantly, what type of negotiator you are. And this is really the nuts and bolts of a lot of this. So there's actually a book out there called Bargaining for Advantage. It's by Richard Shanel, and I have used this book numerous times in terms of identifying what type of negotiator I am and what type of styles other people have. So there's 5 actual types of negotiators. The first one is avoidance. You avoid it. And when I was talking to my students in class, I teach team building and conflict resolution. It's a 400 level class. We actually talked about this last week. And I asked the class, does anyone avoid it? And a couple of people raised their hand. And they see it as conflict. And let's be honest, most people do not like conflict. So the problem with that is that you got to get over it. It's not a conflict. You're trying to get to resolution. And considering we've all been negotiating since we could talk, you have to remind yourself that this is not conflict. Like when you were little and you wanted a cookie, you asked your mother for 2 cookies and maybe you would get 1 cookie, or you wanted to stay up late or whatever. But the thing is that a lot of people try to avoid conflict so much that they see negotiations as conflict, and it really isn't. The next one is compromise, which you see a lot in personal relationships as well. And this entails each side coming to some agreement that gains are equal between them. So as an example, anyone who's bought a house knows this, that let's say the price of the house, just keep numbers easy. Let's say that they have it on the market for $100,000 and you put a bid in for $80,000. And eventually the seller counters and you end up in the middle. So you pay $90,000 for the house. That's a compromise. That sometimes can take some time, but so if you're looking for a quick, type of negotiation, that might take a little bit of time. So that's something else you need to consider. The next one is accommodating. And to be honest with you, if you're in a job search negotiation, this is not the most practical, because most likely you as the job seeker is going to lose out. So the way that this works is that you're being nice and accommodating. So again, you're going to be the one that's going to lose. And so they might say, like an HR professional or the hiring manager may say something like, oh, we can't, you may say, well, I want $100,000. And the person says, no, we can't afford that because of our salary grades, or, your boss makes that kind of money as well, or things like that. So you say, okay, all right, I guess I'll have to accept, 80,000 or whatever the number may be. The problem with that is in the end, you will feel bitter, because I can tell you right now, companies, especially in this market, which is a very tight market, you can negotiate other types of things. So it might be that you're negotiating, instead of just base bonus, maybe long-term incentive, sign-on bonus. Maybe they'll pay for your gym membership. Maybe they'll throw in some other types of perks. They'll pay for maybe an advanced degree, or pay for part of an advanced degree. Maybe they'll let you work out of your home 1 day a week or a couple days a week. So there's all other types of things that you can negotiate if someone says, oh, well, we can't go beyond the salary band. This is, this is the company policy, et cetera, et cetera. So accommodating doesn't really work well, because in the end, you are the one who's going to lose out. The next one is the competitive strategy. And this works well in situations that it's expected that you are going to negotiate. So again, a good example of that is buying a car. I mean, outside of Saturn, when they used to have their cars and you came in and you spent that amount that was on the sticker, in most cases, even if you're buying a used car, the car dealer is expecting you to negotiate. So, you're going to try to, figure out any kind of tactic on how to do that. So the only thing is with that one is that some people go into a dealership and they're very unrealistic, or they're obnoxious. And, we've seen these in the movies, kidding around and things like that. But the reality is that if you're going to go in competitive, you still have to be respectful. And I can't stress that enough. I mean, you're not going to go into a restaurant and have a steak dinner and it's, say, $25, and you're going to start negotiating with the waiter on that. This is more in an environment where they're expecting you to negotiate. Even, to be honest with you, college tuition these days, a lot of people are going back to the admissions office and saying, well, my son or daughter got a scholarship at other university for X. Is there anything we can do about that? So there is a competitive nature even in that. The last one is collaborative. And this approach can be viewed as the most creative, but it also is the most time consuming. This consists of brainstorming ideas and resolving tough issues to come to an amicable offer. So again, if you're looking at, trying to figure out, like, let's say you're getting laid off because the company's being sold and they're offering you, let's say outplacement services, but you had relocated from another town and now your spouse, you want to relocate back or you want to relocate someplace else because there's no other types of jobs in your geographic area, and now the spouse is having an issue. That's a problem. So the thing with that is that you might try to get very collaborative with the person, and again, you're trying to come up with other ideas. Maybe they'll offer your spouse outplacement services or things along those lines. So let's see. I'm looking here at one of the chats, and it says, okay, you started a role and it's not living up to the expectations that were set during the interview process. How can you effectively communicate to not to be defensive or transparent management that concessions should be made without putting yourself at risk or looking like a non-compliant or complaining employee? I have to tell you, this is coming up more and more. Being a recruiter for over 30 years, as I said before, it's interesting. I never like newly created positions, and I'll tell you why. So on the job description, maybe you have 10 different aspects that the client is looking for. So the person comes on board, or let me start here. First of all, you find someone that has all 10 pieces. And then they say, oh, well, you introduce someone with an MBA. Now everybody needs to have an MBA. Oh, so-and-so speaks such and such. Now everyone needs to speak a foreign language. So the problem with that scenario is that the expectation of the hiring manager grows and grows and grows. Now they've hired you. And what the job on paper and what you discussed with the hiring manager is not the job that you're doing currently, or it's not what you thought it was going to be. I would argue that you could sit down and have a great conversation with the hiring manager, but in a lot of cases that just doesn't work. Put it down on paper what you are doing every day. Put down on paper what you thought you were going to be doing, and then come up with some ideas or solutions that make sense. So an example, if you were told you were going to make presentations to the board of directors and you're not right now, I would put that in the column of that was one of your expectations. People work better in those kinds of circumstances when it's down on paper because they're only going to hear what they want to hear. They're not really listening as well as they could. We're going to talk about listening a little bit more later. So I would prepare almost like a report and talk to the hiring manager. If you're not getting any resolution on it, you may have to go a step higher. And again, I hate to say it, keep your options open, meaning, keep your eyes open to the marketplace, see what anything else is out there. Not that you want to jump ship immediately, but and keep the job description for a period of time, because a lot of times hiring managers take that job description and they forget about it and they don't realize that, oh, I forgot I put that in there. You have to keep in mind too, if you're in that situation, that a lot of hiring managers are not trained to recruit. And this is a big beef with me. So the problem with that is that they're not asking the right questions, or they're not conveying the position consistently. And so they hire the wrong people. And it's not that you're a bad person or a good person. It's nothing to do with that. But they're not really vetting the candidates properly to get the correct person into those roles. So I would, as I said, suggest putting that all down and really making sure that they really pay attention to what you're saying. Again, don't get angry or emotional, but really sit here and say, okay, how can we move from there? So the next piece of this is, what do you know about the person you're negotiating with? And LinkedIn comes in handy on this one, I have to say, regardless if it's a contract negotiation or a salary negotiation. And what I mean by that is
we're starting to get some questions, and if you just let me know when's a good time, and I can pose some of the questions we're getting.
All right, let me finish this one little piece, and then I will tell you, Shanel. Thank you. So what do you know about the person you're negotiating with? So as I said, LinkedIn is very helpful with this. Not only look at the person that you're talking to, But look to the sidebar on the right. Usually there's people that they work with. So even if it's a contract negotiation, let's say you're negotiating a contract for a 6-month assignment with Joe, and Joe is the CFO. You may also want to look at the president's background, maybe some of the peers to this position, maybe even like the chief human resources officer, the chief marketing officer, just to get a feel for not only the person, but the culture of the company. If it's an old line company and it's maybe family run and the president is a family member and maybe the CFO is not, even though the CFO wants to hire you or whatever, you may get the inkling that the president is really going to be the one in the end that's going to make the final decision. So that's something that you need to think about. You have to take into other considerations too. What if you're negotiating with someone of the opposite gender? That's, some people feel intimidated, women feel intimidated negotiating with men and vice versa. So you have to really understand your feelings about that. Generational. Millennials might be negotiating with a traditionalist, which is, people in their 70s. That's a different type of conversation versus a traditionalist negotiating with a millennial. There's a lot of millennials now, they're almost at 40 years old. So they are in a position to be in leadership roles that they could be the ones that are making the decisions on contracts. Another piece is their connections to others. What's their reputation? So the more that you can find out about the person you're negotiating with and the company, that is going to be critical in the way you negotiate. All right, Shanel, let's take the first question.
So the first question, so we have several. Some, I'll just give you the subject matter. Some are centered around union negotiations and purchasing a purchase. So whether it's car, whether it's furniture. But one from Ariella really piqued my interest. It's if you started a role and it's not living up to the expectations that were set during the interview process, how can you effectively communicate to defensive / non-transparent management that concessions should be made without putting yourself at risk for looking like a non-compliant or complaining employee? I think we've all been there before, where you don't want to be that person, but the job really isn't meeting your expectations. And I think you touched on this a little earlier. So Ariella's looking for a little more expounding on that topic.
Right. Well, I think I've covered that in the sense that, you really need to put it all down on paper. Not only, I would have the job description there, I would then have what other expectations might have been discussed during the negotiations phase. Maybe you were going to be traveling more or you were going to be traveling less. Things along those lines. I'd have like the job description and expectations and then exactly what the job is today. And you're not complaining. Again, I think that's a really bad word, complaining. What you're trying to do is create a solution. So if you go into the hiring manager with a solution or look as like a solution provider versus being someone who's just complaining, I think that will go over better with that person. But again, you need to know the type of person you're negotiating with. So how long have you been in the role? Have you tried to approach the person before? If you have, you need to, after you've had that conversation, you need to take a step back and say, did I handle this the best way I could? And a lot of times I think, emotions get into it or nerves. And so you have to really kind of figure that out. But I think having everything down on paper is the smart move. And then if that doesn't work, unfortunately, you're going to have to maybe go to a step up to their boss and or go over to human resources. In terms of union negotiations, those are tricky because of the fact that a lot of unions are very, set in their ways. But again, you have to figure out why that they're being difficult about certain things. So maybe they haven't had a salary increase in X number of years. That's understandable. Everyone wants to have their salary increased every year. So trying to maybe work with them and trying to say, I'm willing to work with you, maybe using that collaborative approach, which does take time. We've seen it in the news recently about, teachers and other types that have tried to be a little more creative in salary negotiations. So really trying to build that relationship with the union leader or other members of the union and really peeling the skin away from the onion and really understanding what they're asking for and what they're willing to give up. Sometimes asking that question too and say, look, I can't give you everything you want. What's your A priority list and what's your B priority list, and see if we can work through that. In terms of buying things, I have to tell you, you can negotiate almost anything. And we're going to talk a little bit more in a minute about how you do that. But one of the things that you need to think about is having small wins. So if you're looking to negotiate a car, as I said before, even though they're expecting you to negotiate, but you get very nervous or you see it as conflict, try something else. I always tell people to go to Manhattan. I'm a native New Yorker. I grew up right outside of Manhattan. So I'm really good at, bargaining with the people on the streets about, jewelry, or they sell hats or scarves or whatever. I never pay the price they tell me. I actually just bought a purse recently on the streets of Manhattan. And all my friends make them do it I do it for them, because I see it as a game to some extent. And, I've walked away too. There's been times I have walked away. But having that small win and building that confidence and knowing I can do that, then you can build your way up to maybe the bigger types of products or services that you're looking to negotiate. Are there any other questions, Shanel?
That's all we have for now.
Okay. So really role play the conversation. Envision it. Even if you have to put yourself, put two chairs in let's say your living room, and pretend the other person's sitting in the other chair, or get someone, a friend or a family member or a colleague, to sit in that other chair, and really role play how that conversation is going to go. Have that person push back. Have that person come up with different questions that maybe you didn't even think about. And how are you going to, use your words? Body language comes into huge play at this point, because I know for myself, I am not a poker player, and I blush very easily. So I know if I get thrown a curveball question, it's going to show more in my body language than in what I actually say. The other thing is you're, again, even with the union negotiations, you're trying to draw the people out. You're trying to understand why they're negotiating the way they are. So a great tip is to ask how and what questions. How did you come to this conclusion about this salary? Or how did you come to this conclusion about this piece of the contract? Or what can we talk about that in terms of priorities? Things along those lines. What you want to try to avoid are the why questions. And the reason for that is why questions tend to be negative, and it does tend to come back from our childhood. Why did you hit Johnny on the playground? Why did you get sent to the principal's office? Why questions in general can be very defensive. So, instead of saying, well, why did you come up with this number? And you've got your arms crossed and a stern look on your face, you might say, what were the parameters that you came up with for this figure? Or how did you come to this figure? Again, choose your words carefully, but more importantly, you have to worry about your body language. If it is a face-to-face conversation, you really have to dress the part too. So don't, if you have a power outfit, as they used to say, the power suit, definitely wear that. You don't want to be too intimidating, meaning if it's a type of organization that you're going into for a business contract and they wear jeans all the time, you might not come in with necessarily the power suit, but for gentlemen it might be a nice blazer and khakis, and a woman it might be a dress versus the power suit. But again, you need to feel confident in what you're wearing, because that will also exude confidence in your negotiations. Again, watch your words and what you say. You want to avoid words also like can't, won't, and don't, because I can guarantee it, when you say you can't do something, there's ways around it. There is always ways around it. I recently did a presentation similar on this topic, and someone said, well, you can't negotiate with a doctor. Before I could say anything, someone else in the audience said, yes, you can. If you pay cash, you might be able to negotiate with that. So again, when you're buying a product or service, possibly if you're paying cash, or you can pay in 10 days versus 30 days, you may have more leverage. So that's something else to consider too, is the way you pay the person, not necessarily the amount.
Beth, along the along the spectrum of confidence, this is a great question that speaks to the psychology of negotiations. This comes from Dan. Dan asks, how do you handle negotiations when you have a reputation of getting a great deal done more often than not? He finds that across the table, I guess the people he's negotiating with are wary of him because he's won numerous times in the past. So as a result of that, they try to play hardball because they feel like possibly they may have conceded or acquiesced to his negotiations in the past. So sometimes they may come a little harder at him as a result of that. How would you address that?
That's a tough one, but I think it's still doable. And I think that's the piece that you have to keep in mind. It is doable. So they might, but there again, you need to understand who you're negotiating with. So if they're playing hardball, is it because they just see it as, oh, we want to win, we want to win this time and Dan loses? Or is it, that they feel that, yes, as you said, they got maybe taken advantage of, or they didn't get the best deal the last time, things along those lines. So I think it's something that, again, you need to figure out who you're negotiating with. But if you're sitting across the table from 3 people and they're just not budging, one question is, do you really want to work with them again? And 2, what is a win-win that you're willing to give up? And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But you have to keep the same energy level as they are. So if they're playing hardball, to some extent, you're going to have to play hardball, even if that's not your favorite thing to do. And yes, you've had a lot of success. So to be honest with you, I think it's more that they're intimidated by him. And so you either have to somehow reduce the intimidation a little bit or let them win, make them feel that they're winning a little bit more. So that would be the way to handle it. But again, you really have to know, who you're negotiating with. I think there's another question here.
Yep, along the lines of sales negotiations, it comes from Paul. And multiple stakeholders on the customer side, for example, a procurement officer, maybe engineers, CFO, CIO. How do you address and satisfy each stakeholder to achieve an optimal win-win scenario? We always hear that win-win, but when you have several people at the table, how do you address it to make sure everybody feels like they won?
Well, I guess to start, you have to figure out who is the primary stakeholder. So for argument's sake, just looking at his question, let's say the CFO is the final, because he's the one that he or she's managing, the budget and all of that. So if that's the primary stakeholder, then you really have to kind of almost address that person. You still need to build relationships with the others because they're the ones who are going to go back maybe to that CFO and say, oh, it was great, so far I've been negotiating with Sally and, I feel like we've come to a good resolution here and, was very prompt in responding back. That's another piece too of this that we haven't talked about is that if once someone throws a number out, so if this company, is negotiating with me and they say, well, we want to pay you X, be prompt in responding back. I'm not saying respond back that second, but be receptive, but be prompt, because I can't tell you how many times I've had clients that have made offers to candidates and then the candidates sit on it. 24, maybe 48 hours, especially if there's a weekend involved, that's fine. Or you may say to them, what's the last day I can respond to this, which I don't really like that question, but if you're for some reason traveling or whatever. But I think that you need to figure out who the primary stakeholder is first, and then, but still treat everyone with respect along the way. And you don't want to jump over someone either unless you absolutely have to. So again, if you're negotiating with 5 people on the other side and right now you're negotiating with the procurement manager and the procurement manager is not getting back to you, then you might have to jump a level to, let's say, the director of X. So it's understanding the hierarchy. It's also understanding the interrelationships amongst them as best as you can. So maybe someone is feeling intimidated by someone else in the group. It's, a lot of this is more the psychological piece than the nuts and bolts. So it's really understanding the dynamics between all of them, because even in salary negotiations, even though the hiring manager may be making that, that final decision, they still have to collaborate with HR and their boss and the rest of the organization. So that's really a key factor here. Any other questions?
No, that's it for now.
Okay, so let's do a poll. Let's do another poll. What kind of negotiator are you? So again, are you the type that, the poll is open right now. Are you the type that avoids conflict, so you want to avoid negotiations? Are you more of a compromiser? Maybe you're more of an accommodator. Maybe you like the game, which kind of me on the streets of Manhattan. I can be very competitive when I want to be. Or maybe you want to be more creative and you're very collaborative. And to be honest with you, some people probably are having struggle with this question, this poll, because of the fact that it might be situational. Maybe like when you're home and maybe you have a spouse or significant other, maybe you're more accommodating or compromising. But when you're in a negotiation like we just talked about for, let's say, the union, maybe you're very competitive. Maybe you're trying to negotiate with your, with another type of vendor, and for whatever reason you don't like the conflict between them or you don't feel good about it, so you avoid them. So there's different types, and I guess part of it's situational, but try to think overall, what type of negotiator you are.
So I'm sharing the results right now, Beth.
Okay.
And you can see that the lead goes to, we have a competitive group on the line. Competitive negotiator came in first. Collaborative came in second. And then avoidance, compromise, and accommodate are all tied for 11%. So it looks like we have a competitive and collaborative group.
And as Bryant alum, I would think that would be the case. That's good to hear. The other thing is that, if you're in a position where more junior people that work under you are going to start to negotiate, work with them on this. This has been a hot topic with my students as they're looking at their first jobs. Now they've had internships, some of them have had summer jobs, and they've negotiated to some extent, but they really don't have the whole realm of negotiations. Even people, a lot of people don't have. Negotiations just seems to be a hot topic these days. So for those that are competitive, again, peel the skin away from the onion on yourself. Why are you competitive? Is it you like the win? You get all excited about the win? Is there pressure from your boss to get the win, or a spouse? You'd be surprised when people are doing salary negotiations. If I'm really talking, if I have a good rapport with a candidate and I'm like wondering why they're now asking for this or that or this, a lot of times it's coming from the spouse or a family member. Even when I was negotiating for my first house, there was a problem with the house, and so we wanted to pay a lower amount of money, and the homeowner wouldn't do it. So we walked away from the deal. We found out months later that it was his father that was very influential on it, and he ended up selling the house for $20,000 less than we were willing to offer. So sometimes you need to figure out who the influencers are behind the person you're negotiating with. Okay, so how to respond to the offer. So as I said, you need to listen carefully. The problem is that none of us are really good listeners. There's very few people out there that are really good listeners. And the reason for that is that we're already formulated in our head how to respond. When I do team building courses or workshops, I usually do a listening exercise. And I break people down into, pair them up. And I pick a topic like the weather. And one person talks for a solid 2 minutes. And the other person can't talk. They can't ask questions. They can't formulate what they want to say in response. They can't talk. And it's very, very hard because we're always, we multitask, we do all kinds of other things, but you really need to listen carefully. And as I said, you need to watch the body language. If someone's kind of wiggling in their chair or not showing good eye contact or, as I said, like blushing or, any of those types of things, there's reasons behind it. Their body is definitely telling you something. So really pay attention to that. Cultural issues come up to play. Some countries, if you're negotiating overseas, and a lot of times if you're buying product overseas, you're dealing with different cultures. Even in this country, you're dealing with different cultures. People, from the South negotiate differently than people in, the Northeast, that differentiate from people out West. So you have to take that into consideration as well. And you have to be very sensitive to it. Maybe there's certain words or mannerisms or things that they just don't do. And again, the gender issues too. Traditionalists, they might feel that they're not being respected enough because you're negotiating. They're not used to it. Versus millennials and now the iGen, which is starting to come into the workforce, they're just starting to. They're more comfortable with negotiations. When I graduated from Bryant, this was the salary. I took it. That was it. I didn't think twice about negotiating. But I have to say, I'm very proud of the Bryant students that graduated in May, including my own son. And that they did. They all negotiated for more money, and a lot of them got it. So again, my father always said you can negotiate down, you can't negotiate up. So make sure you know the max that you feel comfortable negotiating with. Again, ask for time to respond if possible. Sometimes there's reasons why you can't, you need to respond immediately. But in most cases, you can have a little bit of time to respond. So really, make sure that you're on the same page. What is the expectation of how you do that? Determine reveal what, don't reveal your BATNA as soon as possible. Wait a little while. Now, what's BATNA? It's a term coined by Roger Fisher and William Ury in their best-selling book, Getting to Yes, Negotiating Without Giving In. BATNA stands for Best Alternative to a Negotiated Agreement. So pretty much what it is, it's your plan B. So, or your plan C, or your plan D. So you need to figure out all your plausible alternatives that you might pursue, but you also have to determine what your deal breakers are. But as you determine each alternative, you need to figure out or estimate the value associated with that alternative. So if someone gives you a 6-month contract, maybe you'll throw in a few extra free hours. Or if that's not going to work, maybe you'll, I don't know if it's a product, maybe you'll throw in maybe you get a 2-for-1 deal or something like that. But the thing is that you really do need to understand what your BATNA is. Because that's what a lot of people don't do. They say, well, this is what I want, I'm not backing down, and that's that. Now, if it's a salary negotiation and the numbers are lower than your budget, of course, you're not going to accept that. But again, there's ways to work around it. And if that still doesn't work, then you need to walk away. A lot of times, bonuses come into play with this and long-term incentive, because if you have a 3-year vest, you may be walking away from, let's say, $100,000. So if the hiring company says, all right, well, we'll make you whole by giving you a sign-on bonus, that would be one way to deal with that. So you really need to spend the time figuring out, what your ideal offer would be, what's your BATNA, and go 1 or 2, 3 maybe types of BATNAs and really figure that out. Discuss when to follow up. I mean, that sounds like a really basic thing, but in reality, actually a lot of people forget to ask that question. So, sometimes people will say at the end of an interview, what's the next step? You really need to ask these questions, because you don't want to sound desperate. You don't want to sound like you're complaining. But on the flip side, if you don't ask the question, you don't know. And my father has another famous expression called talk is cheap, which means you can always ask. The worst you're going to hear is no. So if you say to the person you're negotiating with, can I have a week to counter offer or to respond to your offer, they may say no. But we're so fearful of hearing the word no, we don't ask. So make sure that you ask all the questions you need to ask so that you can make an intelligent decision moving forward. And then, as I said before, you need to be able to walk away and learn to say no. Is there any more questions, Shanel?
Yes, there is. Paul has a question, and this question is, will you address behavior modification? So we talked earlier about the different types of negotiator you are. He's asking, for example, help a salesperson transform from a messenger to a more competitor or collaborative style negotiator. Can you talk a little bit about that behavior modification and how someone can make that transition? I assume that's what you're asking, Paul.
So in that case, again, it goes back to getting those small wins. You've got to build up the confidence of that person. So maybe you give them the opportunity to negotiate on a small contract. And if you lose the contract, it's not as big a deal. And then keep building it up. Also have them watch maybe you if you're trying to motivate your sales force. Sometimes, as I said before, you're role playing yourself, but maybe watching others role play or actually in the negotiation see. And then, feedback is going to be important. So if you have a more junior person sitting in with you on the negotiations and you're very transparent and you explain everything, they can see how you handle it. But then go back to them after and say, okay, what were the takeaways from this? What did you learn from this? Because it does take time. No one, necessarily is the best negotiator from day one. It does take time. The other thing is, again, you need to understand their behaviors. So, there's different assessments that you can do, like the DISC assessment, which answers the how you behave. People respond differently. And that also goes back to, are you an extrovert or are you an introvert? A lot of times people don't realize that introverts can be really good negotiators, but they do it differently than extroverts. Introverts have to process the information maybe longer, or they at least need to process it differently. So if there's an extrovert, negotiating with an introvert, the extrovert might want the answer then, or they might respond quicker, or all of that. But the introvert needs to, really take it in, really think it through, and then give a response back. So to change behavior, you have to understand what the behavior is too. Are they task-oriented or are they more people-oriented? So if you have an extrovert who's very people-oriented, which is me, I want to feel good, right? I want the other person to feel good, and I want to chit chat, and I want to understand the person in a different way, maybe even on do they have kids and a family, or what do they do on the weekends? I build a different kind of rapport versus maybe someone who's very task-oriented wants to cut to the chase and just let's negotiate, let's get this done and move on. So to change behaviors, you have to understand what the behaviors are. So, you might do a negotiation a certain way because you are task-oriented and you're an introvert versus someone like me who's an extrovert and who's people-oriented. So and then again, as much role-playing as you can do, either having them watch you, having you do it with them, or taking even a negotiations class, which there's many of those out there. Any other questions?
No, I think that's it for now.
Okay, so let's talk. We only have a few minutes left. Let's talk about mistakes. So again, talking too much. It's okay to kind of hold your cards close to the vest a little bit, because if you reveal too much, you may not have any bargaining power moving forward. So really make sure that you're not revealing too much. The next piece is taking it personally. It's a negotiation. It's a widget. It's a service. It's a contract. Don't take it personally. Unless you've done something catastrophic, which I can't imagine anybody doing that. Don't take it personally. The person's not out to get you in most cases. So, don't show your emotions. Show high EQ. If you're dealing with someone who has low emotional intelligence, unfortunately, that's a challenging situation. But you personally need to, be confident, be respectful, and really, realize that it's a negotiation. It's not the end all be all, and there's ways to work around it. But having said that, especially if you're competitive, you can't be arrogant. I had one student last semester, he was negotiating something and he's like, take it or leave it. And if you look at the last bullet, it's the same thing. This is my final offer. You can't do that. Be respectful. Say, I would love to negotiate more with you, or I'd like to try to make this a different situation, but this is the best I can do. But saying that this is my final offer, or making the person, don't patronize the person either. That's not a good way to do it either. Some people, and I've had this happen, maybe two people are being hired, or maybe there's two different contracts. or you just, you got the contract and you felt good, but then after the fact, you're like, oh, I was speaking to so-and-so and I could have gotten more money. You can't change your mind after you accept. That's just not good business practice. Unless there's something, again, catastrophic, which I can't imagine any of us are doing, you can't change your mind after you accept. Not willing to walk away. You got to do your BATNAs. So if you create your BATNAs and then this person doesn't even get to those and are not willing to negotiate, you have to be willing to walk away. So that's why you need to look at alternatives, not only with your BATNAs, but you also need to look at your alternatives in terms of who else could you go to if you can't get what you want. So if Shanel is looking, let's say, to buy a medical piece to go into a bigger product, and he's figured out how much he wants, like what the ideal situation is. He's figured out 2 other BATNAs, and it's still not going to work out. He better in his hip pocket know who that second vendor is that he can go to and start negotiating with them. Again, make sure you consider the bigger picture here. You want to build rapport with people, not just for this negotiation necessarily, but maybe there's future business. So when you're negotiating, keep the bigger picture in mind. Maybe they'll give you more work. Maybe they'll refer you to others, as we talked about before. The biggest problem with negotiations, and believe me, I've done a lot of research on this, is not being prepared. Make sure you've done your homework. Use a mentor, or talk to someone else too, and make sure that you really lay it out with someone that a trusted advisor that can say to you, okay, I think you're missing this piece, or I wouldn't word it this way, I would word it that way. Really make sure that you are prepared. But having said that, the emotional piece comes in, or the behavioral piece comes in on trusting your gut. I've made this mistake several times, especially when the economy tanked. I'll be the first to admit, I was taking a lot of work in, and there were a couple times I had conversations with people, and in the back of my head, I'm like, I'm not sure I really want to work with this person. Ended up working with a person, and it was a nightmare. 80% of our problems come from 20% of our clients. So if your gut's telling you that this still is not a good negotiation, or this is not going to work out and be a good business relationship, get out of it. Being arrogant is also possibly being overconfident, so be careful with that. Check your ego at the door. I can't imagine any Bryant alum would seek revenge, but you might be the recipient of someone seeking revenge, so just be very careful with that. And then, of course, as I said before, you never say that this is my final offer. So that's what I have to tell you about negotiations. You have to practice. You have to look at the bigger picture, do your homework, understand your behaviors and what you bring to the table. And then after negotiation, either if it goes well or even if it doesn't go well, you need to, rethink what you've done and see the patterns you have in your negotiations. Maybe you always tackle a negotiation the same way every time, and maybe it's worked for you for a while. As we talked about the person that they wanted to play hardball with because he's always been successful. Yes, you might have a pattern of negotiations, but you also have to be a bit flexible, because I can tell you that there will be a time when you're negotiating and a curveball will come through and you won't be prepared. So really try to figure out every single issue that could come about. So I really appreciate your time today. If you have any other questions, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. Here's all my contact information.
Well, Beth, thank you so much for that. I was challenged because I'm trying to take notes and listen at the same time because it was so much good information. But the call is recorded, so we'll send out a list, a link for you to access this call as well as future calls. But on the behalf of the Bryant Alumni Association, Beth, I really want to thank you for a thought-provoking presentation. And most of all, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today and for your thoughtful questions. They were really good questions, and I think one or two stumped Beth a little, but the expert she is, she was able to give you some good advice. So thank you for that. As I mentioned, our entire webinar series archive can be found at alumniconnect.bryant.edu/webinars. So if you enjoyed this webinar or want to suggest a topic for the future, Please look out for the survey in your email following this call, and upcoming events can be found at the bryant.edu/alumni event site. So this will conclude today's webinar. I want to thank you and have a great day. Take care, everyone.